Hello and welcome. My name is Alan, and we are back with more Southern Horrors and Other Writings by Ida B. Wells. Yeah, now we'll be getting into some more in depth things because she's kind of gave us the introduction here with how lynchings kind of work, but let's jump into this. The response of the African American community. Reconstruction was a positive force in the lives of the freed men and women. Is marked roughly from the end of the Civil War in 1865 until President Rutherford B. Hayes issued orders in 1877 removing the last of the federal troops from the South. By 1876, most of the Reconstruction coalitions had already lost control of the local legislatures. In Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Georgia, Confederates had been quickly re-enfranchised. The process took much longer in Mississippi, Louisiana, and South Carolina, where shifts in political power were sometimes violently wrought through coercion, intimidation, and other acts of force. By removing federal oversight in 1877, President Hayes returned home rule to the South and full power to ex-Confederates and Southern Democrats. By the 1878 national elections, Democrats, rather than Republicans, controlled the U.S. Senate and the House of Representatives. The erosion of gains for African American people was well on its way. Chief among the reasons for the failure of Reconstruction was that without the redistribution of land in the South, African Americans were unable to develop an economic base for their newly acquired political rights. In addition, after years of turmoil, the attention of Northerners was focusing more on the reconciliation and economic opportunities in the South and less on the terrorist methods by which power and control were being reestablished and maintained. Further, with the return of home rule, Southerners were free to construct white supremacy as they chose. Unmistakably, by the 1880s, the era of post-Reconstruction had begun. While African Americans continued to struggle for voting rights and civil liberties, hindering their progress was yet another reenactment of many of the provisions of the black codes in the newly established Jim Crow laws. These laws firmly reinscribed boundaries between whites and African Americans, controlled their social, political, and economic lives, and became the way of Southern life until such practices were finally ended with the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1864. Or 1964, sorry. So yeah, Civil War ends 1865. Takes another 100 years before we get the Civil Rights Act. During this time of increased mob activity, African American leaders recognized the precarious position of their people and spoke out passionately to reduce the rising tide of violence. They saw that it was open season on them for intimidation, wanton destruction of their crops and property, and open punishment outside of the law without fear of retaliation or formal prosecution. African Americans found themselves disenfranchised, economically at risk, and powerless to protect themselves, and they recognized that these patterns of domination needed to be vehemently resisted. Leaders called for the various forms of community action. Conservative positions envisioned change was slow and envisioned change as slow and incremental. This stance would later be epitomized by Booker T. Washington, president of the Tuskegee Institute and national spokesman for African American concerns. More radical positions, such as those assumed by T. Thomas Fortune, editor of the New York Age, and Monroe Trotter, editor of the Boston Guardian, saw change emerging from the more direct confrontation with the issues. The one early form of community action was mass meetings to raise support funds and to develop responses to specific outrages in a given community. National and statewide political conventions constituted another strategy. Community leaders such as Frederick Douglass, a noted abolitionist writer, orator, and diplomat, Blanche K. Bruce, a senator from Mississippi, John Mercer Langston, a U.S. representative from Virginia, Bishop James Alexander Shorter of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, and others called meetings to draw the attention of the African American community to an array of concerns. The national convention called by Frederick Douglass was typical. On September 24, 1883, 300 delegates from 27 states met in Louisville, Kentucky. At this meeting, Douglass denounced lynching, setting a pattern for future conventions in placing lynching prominently on the agenda. The need for solidarity and for cooperation with white allies was also discussed. These meetings demonstrated the active commitment of African Americans to causes of justice, equality, and empowerment. But despite their dedication to reform, the political conventions were largely unsuccessful in stemming the tide of mob violence. In addition to political conventions, other organizational efforts signaled the end of African Americans were far from passive in response to mob violence. While leaders like Douglass sought to forge alliances with white activists, more radical leaders such as T. Thomas Fortune had come to prefer independent action that did not seek alliance with whites. In May of 1887, Fortune established the Afro-American League, envisioned as an all-black self-help organization. At the beginning, the League established lynching as a central issue, but after the first convention, attention shifted to anti-discrimination activities, agitating for social equality as well as political and economic opportunity. Fortune was endorsed in this effort by African American newspaper editors across the country, including Ida B. Wells, and was successful in organizing local branches of the organization and in holding 2 national conventions. In 1893, however, the national organization no longer functioned. A central problem was that Fortune and the other editors were unable to garner a base of support among the masses of African Americans in critical sectors of community activity. For example, within the black church and among black Republicans. The majority of these leaders were Southern and were not inclined to defy Southern attitudes about social behavior or to forego white patronage in agitating for social equality. In essence, the League did not develop effective lines of communication with the majority of African Americans, and their attention to anti-discrimination action and social equality rather than to protect from lynching as the common problem across socioeconomic strata set them apart as elitist. A second organization established to address the problem of lynching was the Equal Rights Council. Bishop Henry McNeil Turner of the African Methodist Episcopal Church issued a call for a convention to be held in Cincinnati, Ohio, from November the 28th through December the 1st of 1893. George L. Knox, editor of the Indianapolis Freeman, was instrumental in publishing the ideas of prominent leaders about the convention and in establishing a national organization. After a short while, the council emerged with the African American League, but in neither configuration did these organizations gather strength as an anti-lynching movement. But we'll go ahead and end that there. Let's go ahead and check some of the sources at the bottom. If they have anything important here. Nothing on that page. Civil Rights Act of 1864 forbid discrimination in the use of public facilities. So whites and blacks could use the same water fountains, could use the same bathrooms, because they're people. On the next page, for a more detailed discussion of this type of community activism, see Grant, 1975. And let's see. It is worth noting that Booker T. Washington rose in prominence as a central facilitator of support for black people. Fortune would become an ally. So yeah, Booker T. Washington, and then what was the dude's name? Fortune, Thomas T. Thomas Fortune. But yeah. So now we're looking at the end of Reconstruction, which again is usually identified as 1877, when Rutherford B. Hayes takes power. In a bargain, he agrees to take troops out of the South because the election was so close that technically Rutherford B. Hayes might not have actually got the presidency, but a deal was struck. And yeah, it ended up with the end of Reconstruction and a dark era of shame. You know, as bad as slavery itself was, it would only get worse in the post-Reconstruction South. Because at least before, you had freedmen getting elected to positions of government, owning businesses. Here you have a 12-year period where it looks like, hey, things might actually be turning, and the rug gets just jerked out from under you. Now you have no protection, and there's these hate mongers who are willing to use these vile tactics. And it seriously did a lot of damage. People were not just hurt, many were killed, as is the case in lynchings. Yeah. I mean, and like I cited while I was reading, Civil War ends in 1865, but it isn't until 1964 that the Civil Rights Act, which just guaranteed them the right to use the same facilities, the same schools. Basically, hey, separate but equal is a bullshit proposition. How about everybody have just the fucking same? Period. Yeah. 100 years. Just to get to that fucking point. It's disgraceful. It really fucking is. And to know that some people are trying to push us backward. People in power are trying to push us backward. Is even more disgusting. It really is. But we'll go ahead and end this episode there. As always, educate thyself. Think, read, study, learn. Someone tries to tell you something you have trouble believing, ask them to cite their sources. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you all in the next one. Until then, later.